One of the peculiar aspects of Sir Robert Menzies was his enthusiastic advocacy of the cause of liberal education. I say peculiar because such a stance was in fact highly unusual in Australia, at least outside fairly limited university circles. And I think also because, as we heard in the last paper, Menzies was not a classicist, and there's strong connections between classicists and advocacy of liberal education, both here and in other places. When I read Menzies on education, it's not John Henry Newman who comes to mind, but rather Samuel Taylor Coleridge and the views expressed in his essay on church and state. That is to say, Menzies' appreciation of the value of liberal education is primarily political, I think, rather than philosophical or theological. The good that a liberal education bestows relates to the political and social order. Hence, Menzies invokes such imperatives as, isn't it on? Oh, is it? Do I have to speak closer? But you said there's no problem with the sound. Is there a problem with the sound? Sorry? Oh, isn't it on? Oh, okay, sorry. This way I can be like Jimmy Barnes or someone, which is okay. Hence, Menzies invokes such imperatives as education for democracy, education for citizenship. There is, we believe, a very powerful connection between Menzies' educational ideals and his lifelong attachment to the Westminster system of government, which David Kemp talks so eloquently about in volume 4 of his history. Liberal education would produce the sorts of people that made that system of government work properly. Equally, Menzies' idealisation of the English and the way that they conduct themselves is not really a slavish devotion to his imperial masters, but rather an appreciation of how a democratic political order should work at a time when democracy was under considerable attack. So we really need to think of Menzies, I think, in terms of the times in which he lived. So one needs to place Menzies in context to see why and how his views on education, and specifically the value of liberal education, developed. And it looks a little bit like this. Menzies spends his early years in the bosom of a powerful empire that's at its zenith. His first 20 years were spent in peaceful and stable world. He would have had every expectation that the British Empire was only in its infancy and could possibly run for centuries. So take the comparison with Rome, you know, it's in its early days. Rome, he would have thought it had centuries ahead of him. Then began the days of tribulation, World War I, Depression, world conflagration. And we must understand Menzies as he develops up until the end of World War II in the context of these changes. Menzies decided that he stood for democracy as the expression of his British heritage in a world that was facing fascism and communism in the 1930s, and in a world in which liberal democracy could come to an end, if you're looking at the viewpoint of the late 30s, early 40s. So we've got to recapture that context, that sense of what it was like to be living through the 30s and the 40s, the war, to get an appreciation, I think. So Menzies decided early that he stood for democracy as the expression of his British heritage, and he first writes on universities. Is this the right way around? Is that the right way around? No, that's not the right way around. Have I gotten to the second one? No, it's the first one. Oh, well, with that, at this time at Melbourne University, but I'm not, that'll be in the extended paper, but not today. In the wake of the Depression and the rise of communism, fascism, Nazism, Menzies, I think, becomes more strident in his defence of democracy and his identification of democracy with Britain, especially England. Hence, like Hancock, W.K. Hancock, he condemns dictatorship as the victory of Machiavelli. And I don't think he's defending England because he's some English reactionary in empire, but rather because it provides the best model of a stable democracy for a British country such as Australia. So he's got the last concrete example of a working democracy. Well, it's England, so why wouldn't you look at the English model? In the measure of the years, Menzies indicates that his interest in education was really only fully developed in the wake of World War II. However, it is clear that his interest in Britain and the preservation of democracy led him to develop his ideas on this matter in the 1930s. He approached education from the viewpoint of idealism and the need for spirit, and the way in which these features were concretely expressed in English schools and universities. He understood that the institutions of a democratic order needed to be underpinned by an appropriate culture, and his developing ideas on education indicate what sort of culture that should be and the best way of bringing it about. He was a democratic elitist. In other words, he believed democracy meant a country being run under the Westminster system by an elite. Those with talent would be given the opportunity to develop that talent and use it to serve the community. Those individuals would receive a liberal education as to enable them to expand their capacity beyond narrow materialism and self-interest. They would be ones who ensured that democracy worked as it did within the framework of the Westminster system. They would stand above the sordid particular interests of the everyday world. Now, this vision, interestingly enough, has powerful Platonic and almost, let's say, Hegelian resonances in the way that it's understood. There's the idea that in Hegel, if you read Philosophy of Right, that the government of right stands above particular interests. I think Menzies understood that we needed people who stood above particular interests. These would be the bureaucrats who are given liberal education, so they have the proper training to do so. What we'd like to do is to examine what we believe are three key works by Menzies between 1930s and 45. The first is a paper that he delivered it was delivered on his behalf, the article tells us. I get to the next one. At St John's College, Morpeth in 1937. Now, when I saw that he'd at least had a paper delivered on his behalf at St John's, that made me rather excited. St John's College, Morpeth, of course, is where Ernest Bergman had been. People like Elkin had been there. And actually, Bergman had hoped that St John's would become a university. So it was like a 1920s and 30s think tank. It's also hardly a place one would normally think of Menzies if one was thinking in terms of sort of, laissez-faire liberalism, for example. So it's interesting. In the paper, a report of which appears in the Newcastle Herald, the only place I could find it, Menzies stated that his primary theme was the relationship between modern civilization and the liberty of the individual. The test of civilization, he claimed, was freedom of the spirit and of the mind and the body. But the problem of what he termed a mechanical age was there had been advances in the realm of bodily freedom, but not necessarily in the realms of spirit and the mind, leaving the problem of a liberated body inhabited by a stunted mind and a poor spirit. The key then was to establish the development of the mind and the spirit. Spiritual freedom necessarily involved intellectual freedom and the capacity to pursue the truth. The free mind and the free spirit were bound up together. The mind was the doorway of the spirit. The enemies were thus twofold. The first was a social order that was two-sided in the materialist direction. Now, that certainly has Coleridge resonances. I don't know if you read Coleridge, but it sounds very much like that sort of position, that the church in Coleridge's was meant to react against those sorts of materialist and commercial tendencies. The second was totalitarianism and the desire to glorify power in opposition to democracy that allowed the achievement of individual freedom and development. Menzies then moves to analyse what might be described as the evils of the modern world. These include the tendency in modern European history for liberty to degenerate into licence. Oh, wouldn't I love to hear a leader today say that? Liberty can degenerate into licence. Very 19th century, very 19th. No one uses the term licence anymore, do they? For the sober presentation of facts by the press to degenerate into propaganda. For the cinema to feed people's imagination with an absurd diet of false sentiment and false values. He summed up the problems with education in these terms. The new ambition was to breed a race of people to whom leisure was the chief end of life and the insistence upon a standard of accuracy abhorrent. Hey, that sounds a bit like certain tendencies today, I think, but we won't go there. Education was already featuring as both a problem and a solution to the problems in the modern world. Again, a quote, the shrinking from the arduous labours of thought and the abdication of the responsibility of judgment, good word, judgment, in favour of somebody else constituted the subtlest of all attacks upon freedom because people made themselves slaves to someone else. Another quote, without minds that were informed, they toughened by exercise, broadened by inquiry, and fearless in pursuit of truth, they could never hope to have spirits untrammelled by blinding ignorance or distorting prejudice. Freedom would never be gained without discipline, which was based on an intelligent understanding of the fact that order and unity were essential if the liberty of the individual was to be reconciled with the rights of other individuals. Notice the education, discipline. People often misunderstand what a liberal education is. Liberal education is as much about really tough ways of thinking. It's not about sitting around on beanbags and throwing ideas out. It's actually got a toughness, which I think that's why I would classify that as a liberal mode of education. Okay, so he's got this viewpoint that's developing in the late 30s. The second thing I want to look at is the 1939 pamphlet on education, which gives some ideas of how his views on liberal education have a political implication. Again, it can be noted that Menzies is reacting against aspects of the modern world of which he either disapproves or finds repugnant. One is material progress, mechanical progress, a sort of Frankenstein monster which may yet destroy us. The other is the uncertainty of the age. Today, when old beliefs are being challenged and old values are being reassessed, and when barbaric philosophies of blood and iron are repugnant, again, he's responding to the terrible circumstances of the late 1930s, blood and iron, dislocation in the wider world. It is a world in which the mere mechanics of life threaten to be the sole vocation of the human spirit. In opposition to these infirmities of the modern age, the university has a special role in place. It has what Menzies terms great and magnificent responsibilities. Those responsibilities relate to what Coleridge had termed permanence. In a world of flux and commerce and change, universities express permanent features of nationality, this is Coleridge, that transcend what might term modernity. So again, it seems he's on this sort of theme. The idea that universities, and I think it's an idea that's permeated down to today, is alike in a secular world the new church. But Coleridge never said that the church was Christian. So it's a sort of idea of the church as a sort of element of, political element of society that has a function to play just as the public service and the law have a function. I think that's how Menzies, that's how I would interpret it anyway, understands that universities are also part of the constitution in the wider sense. So Menzies defends universities as the place where academic learning occurs, an activity that's both civilised and civilising, an activity that the world needs as never before. Menzies defended useless scholarship because it represented sanity in an insane world, that it stands for a due proportion in life and living, that it develops the humane and imperishable elements of man, that it points the moral that the mere mechanics of life can never be the sole vocation of the human spirit. This is clearly a defence of the permanent elements in humanity. Those elements are difficult to express in the flux and hurly-burly of everyday life. So the university, I think, and Menzies formulates this, although implicitly, is really a bit like a church in terms of its role, but it's not a sectarian church, of course. So I'm just going to skip a little bit, but what does attract him also is the calm and tranquility of the life of study and conversation. Rather would I be the man who, when the tumult and shouting dies, enters into the company of his books and thoughts and the conversation of his friends. Again, this sort of image invokes to me the image of, say, Montaigne amongst his books, or Cicero when he's forced out of political life. The need to get the balance correct in political life between the world of political action and the need for reflection. And I think that's how, again, he understands the university. There needs to be a balance between the active life and the contemplative life. We cannot, he says, we cannot all live our lives in students' calm, but a life is not rich, which ones who, I see, what have I done here? This is page. Life is not rich, which contains no cloisters. Its place in a civilised community with a sense of real values would be secure. The academic world and the world of action need to be in dialogue to the benefit of each. University must serve as a liaison between the academician and the good practical man. And it's very pointed here that he refers to All Souls College, Oxford. All Souls College, Oxford was like a think tank. It had no undergraduates, very little in the way of postgraduates. And he may idealise this, but he sees it as a place in which the practical men from London come down and mix with the academics to their mutual advantage. And I think that's very interesting. Again, that's a political conception of what the university is. It's a place that brings the two together. He says All Souls is a window through which Oxford looks out in the world and the world looks at Oxford. It's also interesting in the 1930s that All Souls College, Oxford was in fact the home to one W.K. Hancock. And there's various stages. Hancock and Menzies are in fact reacting, I think, in very similar ways to the crisis of the 1930s, if you read some of Hancock's work. Am I going for time? I've got 2 minutes. Well, I'll just say I was going to talk about the 1945 piece, but in a way he's reiterating part of what he says in the earlier pieces, except that by 1945, one of the changes is that whereas he's talked perhaps in more metaphysical terms before the war, in the period in the speech of 1945, he talks again about pagan and materialist quality of education. He talks in terms of religion, need for obligation. But there seems to be a slight shift where he says the problems. He says, war after war is the result of a failure of the human spirit, not of some superficial elements, but of fatal inability of man to adjust himself to other men in a social world. So there's a slight change in emphasis where it's moving towards social relationships, which isn't so much in the earlier stuff. But as I know you'll all want to talk, I'll leave it there. I think I've said enough to make people think a bit, I hope. I'm sorry I didn't show all the stuff I had on the thing, but we get carried away, so I'll leave it there so you can have time for discussion, hopefully. If you don't have time for discussion, I get to sit down 10 minutes early.
Thank you, Greg. That was fascinating to understand the context of Menzies' thinking on education, particularly in that period of the 30s and 40s when he felt the threat to democracy. I wonder if you could fast forward to 2021 and tell me what you think of how the expectations around the role of universities have changed since Menzies' early thoughts began on liberal education?
Oh, I think the thing is that Menzies had a particular, again, he had an idea that universities had a major, what I call constitutional, in the broader sense, place to play in producing the elite that would basically fill the public service. Actually, in reality, the people who ended up running the public service were not people with liberal education, but I think they had Bachelor of Commerce largely from the University of Melbourne. And Treasury became more important. So there's a bit of a thing there. But you know, I mean, that idea that things would work in harmony together has been replaced by a notion of liberal education that it's relentless criticism. It has to be relentless criticism. So you relentlessly criticise rather than working for the connections and the friendships that are important. So I think that's, he had an understanding which unfortunately may not have turned out the way that he hoped it would.
Yes, I was going to ask you, Greg.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, it's Judy Brett. I retired from La Trobe. I was just going to ask you, in the contrast that you were talking about between the mechanical aspects of modernity and the life of the spirit, whether you think Menzies was influenced by Carlyle, or whether he got Carlyle through Coleridge.
Again, it's difficult to pin influences. He would have read Carlyle. I mean, it's hard to know where his idea of liberal education came from. I mean, for example, if you look at someone like, is it T.G. Tucker, who was at Melbourne in the early 20th century, he doesn't really talk about things the way Menzies does. So one wonders where he picked up this particular notion of mechanical and spiritual and so on. It could very well have been Carlyle, but you would have to actually, and as you have the library here, it's the sort of thing you could actually go back and look if he's got a copy of these things, because he doesn't quote Carlyle as far as I know.
So he may have got it through the Romantics.
He may have got it through
Carlyle gets into English.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's David points out, and it's clear in the 1945 speech, he did read, Richard Livingston, which is curious because I've got a number of Richard Livingston's books in my own library. Livingston was a great classicist. He, great believer in the Greeks. So it's interesting how he would have, that's given that Menzies isn't a classicist, why he's picking up ideas from people who are classicists. If you know that I find that curious. But it's with these things, of course, what may be called tracing intellectual lineages is always extremely difficult because you can't. But if he got it from Romantics, I mean, for example, I've got my grandmother's books of poetry, Shelley, Wordsworth. No, I haven't got Wordsworth. I've got Scott, a whole range of things. So part of it could be reading Romantic poetry, which people of his generation would have read. They would have read a lot of Romantic poetry.
Yeah, Zachary Gorman, the Robert Menzies Institute. I'll ask my own question. Could you please elaborate on what you mean by the university taking up the role of the church?
Again, I'm using it in the way that Coleridge talks about it. He saw the church as universities, the church, all sorts of clerical forms. And I think in Australia, because again, the universities, there's no single religion. You can't appeal to, the Church of England very early gets told you're not the established church. But if you're looking for an institution to play the role of the institution that, let's call it a spiritual repository, then the university becomes the place that you will pin your hopes. Given that he understands that you need greater spirituality in the world, you need something to buff it against. And as I said, that's why I was so fascinated by having given a talk at St John's, because that's the role St John's wanted to take for itself. I mean, people don't understand that the Hunter Valley was in the 20s and 30s, the Hunter Valley is really a centre of Australian intellectual life. Because it's interesting because Evatt was mentioned earlier, and apparently I have read that Evatt was, his second name, Vere, was in honour of the Portis family, who of course were a great Hunter Valley family, and Portis was another South Australian. He ended up in South Australia. There was this whole group of people, largely clergy, Anglican clergy, but it's a wider, broader understanding, non-dogmatic, non-sectarian, yeah.
I had a question, Greg. I wanted to unpack your reference to universities as being there to sort of produce a democratic elite. And you were talking about basically providing a source of human capital for public service. But then latterly, as
would Menzies use a word like human capital? I really wonder whether he'd use a word like human capital. It's
indeed. My question though is, Menzies in the 50s and 60s changed the way universities were funded, expanded Commonwealth funding for universities, doubled the number of universities during his second term in office, from I think 8 to 16. Obviously, thousands more students were able to study. We went from very much an elite at the universities pre-Menzies reforms to much more democratic and open university educated population. How did that marry with his early thinking at university? And of course, then later we had reforms which enabled sort of
I think anyone who's come across the Mandarins of the 50s, 60s and 70s will know they were a special breed in the public service. You know, they were a special breed. They're never going to come back in the way that they were. And I think they were part of the Menzies creation of his vision of the Westminster system. He had a very strong vision of the Westminster system. And obviously, again, with the reference to All Souls College and so on, I mean, in England as well, it was a small, well-educated elite. And I think that's what he probably had in mind, a well-educated group. But that said, I think the other thing which goes to that, he thought that they should have a very strong sense of service. They should stand above the materialist and commercial conflicts. And again, I mean, that would fit, as I understand it, about his relationship with what he did with the Liberal Party as opposed to what the United Australia Party was about, where it was dominated by financial interests. So I think he had, I won't say a guardian class, but he did have that sense that would be what would we end up with. I think he was probably profoundly disappointed with what the universities eventually turned out. I would think he would have been profoundly disappointed that they didn't live up to his expectations.
We have time for one very, very short last question. If anyone had one? Otherwise, Frank, there is a mic.
Thank you. Thanks, Georgina. Thanks, Greg. I would have asked this to Troy too. I mean, it strikes me that one of the, Frank Bongiorno, ANU, it strikes me that one of the almost preconditions for the kind of life, political life, public life that was lived by someone like Menzies, and this would be true actually of a number of the prime ministers of that era up to the 60s, not all of them, but a number of them, both parties, there's also a strong public culture in which there's access to books. And I just wonder, what role that plays. You mentioned the reading of romantic poetry. There's a really interesting book on Curtin and poetry that's just appeared recently. So I just wondered about that kind of underlying public culture that existed in towns like Japara, and what role that plays in, I guess their understanding of book learning and education.
I mean, outside the political sphere, one of the best things on this is David Melleuish. It was a quarterly essay made in Australia where he documents basically what a middle brow culture was like in Australia in the 30s and 40s. And I think that would have been common in a lot of middle class households. And it wasn't necessarily an elite thing. It would be also common amongst people of, of working class who are interested. It perhaps is a hangover of the old Mechanics Institute, School of Arts things, but or even the sort of things Billy Hughes describes in the 1890s, the strong culture of the Labor Party. That these things, unfortunately, we've now been reduced to tweets and TikTok. And apparently, what else can we have? Instagram. You can't, if that's all your diet of reading is, it's very sad, isn't it? But certainly there was a wider culture of reading and so on. The person who sort of represents that, Walter Murdoch, the essayist, represents that sort of culture where people would read and they would have a sort of slightly higher thing. They wouldn't be watching whatever they watch today. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg.